Our keynote address for our post-lunch session today will be given by Sophie Punte, who's the Executive Director of the Smart Freight Center in the Netherlands. Sophie is working for this NGO with the mission of promoting a global freight sector that is more efficient as well as more environmentally sustainable. And Sophie has held a range of responsibilities and jobs both within government, I would say, if we can classify the UN as government, and also within a variety of NGOs. So I'd like to welcome Sophie to the podium for her presentation today on integrated climate solutions.
Just need to figure out how to get to the next slides. Is that this one here?
The big green button.
Oh, good, okay. Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here today, and I thank Priyank for inviting me to give a speech today. I feel a little bit out of my depth, because when I hear all the people talk about ports and adaptation and the detailed measures, that's not my area of specialization. What I believe I can contribute is give you an idea about the broader freight sector and how I believe that ports and inland waterways and any other waterborne structures fit in within the rest of the freight sector. So, you all know this picture. It's about freight and logistics. We have cargo owners, we have customers, we have logistic service providers, carriers, freight forwarders in the middle, and we have different modes that include shipping and across sea, waterways, ports. And what we see is that this whole freight sector, and it's not just relating to ports, but is that it's undergoing an explosive growth. So we're seeing a projection of tripling freight in terms of ton kilometers by 2050. At the moment, $16 trillion of merchandise is being exported, and it's representing 20% of global GDP, so a significant sector. It is a hugely inefficient sector. If we're looking at Europe and the US, as a percentage of GDP, the logistics sector, logistics cost is about 10%. But if you go to, for example, a place like Indonesia, logistics cost is more than 25% of the GDP, meaning that those costs become so high that it actually becomes a bottleneck for economic growth. And finally, it's high impact. Freight sector is 7% of global and 42% of transport CO2 emissions. And of course, we have air pollutants as well, such as diesel emissions, but also SO2, which we see in shipping. So let's put it in perspective. If we see that transport is about 23% of global energy-related CO2 emissions, freight sector is about 42% now, but by the year 2050 it will be about half. In other words, freight is growing faster than any other sector in transport. And if we look at sea, it's about a quarter of those emissions. When we then look at air pollutants, road is by far the biggest contributor to most air pollutions, with the exception of sulfur oxides, where shipping is clearly the highest. And then we go to the targets. What we're seeing now is that if you compare the current emission levels, and if we look at a business as usual scenario by 2050, we will see a rise of emissions by 76%. However, if we were to meet the targets under the Paris Agreement, depending on whether you pick a 2-degree or a 1.5-degree scenario, emissions will have to drop by 20 to 65% compared to current levels. And that's an enormous task. So these figures can, of course, always be debated, but under any scenario, we're talking about double-digit emission reductions compared to the current situation. So just from a mitigation perspective, this is a huge challenge, and from an adaptation perspective as well. If we don't meet this, adaptation is going to be even more important than it already is now. We know the solutions, so we know that you can do something about vehicles, your vessels, your fuels, about the way you move the freight, and about the broader transport system. And here's where I believe that ports, sea, inland waterways need to be connected much better to the other parts of the freight system. So if we're looking now at leadership, and our vision is that we're looking for a more efficient and environmentally sustainable global freight and logistics sector. So what is needed for that? First, unlike passenger transport, we see in the passenger transport sector, we often see that government is taken as a central player. People believe that policies are going to solve the problems. But if we look at the freight sector, it's a commercially driven sector. It's run by businesses with commercial motives. And unless we look at what is the business value from doing something about climate, if we overlook that, we're not going to make it. So it's important to make a distinction between the business value and societal value. Businesses often care for climate, but if it doesn't help their bottom line, they just simply won't invest. Second is we need leadership across the board. So governments need to provide a secure environment. The private sector needs to drive smarter freight across their supply chain. Civil society, and it includes development banks, NGOs, research, need to put freight much, much higher on the agenda. And I believe within freight that adaptation is still way behind from mitigation. And of course we need to consider the consumers in this whole picture, because in the end they're driving the freight demand that we currently see. And then we need to put it in the context of the Paris Agreement with climate targets, and within the context of broader sustainable development goals, where infrastructure, climate, environment, economy, everything comes back that's relevant to this sector. So what we did is we developed a smart freight leadership framework to encompass this all. And what it is, it's about linking the cargo owners with the carriers and making sure that they start taking action to reduce emissions. And in order for them to do that, they need to measure, report, verify their emissions. And my colleague Alan Lewis yesterday explained the GLEC framework to you yesterday, which is one of the ways, which is a global way of calculating emissions. Setting KPIs and targets in a consistent manner. And I heard before also about ports that you need to have better KPIs as well that are consistent around the globe. Having an action plan, collaborating because the sector is too fragmented, there's too many modes for players to go at this alone. And finally, we need proactive policy input from business. What I see still too much is that from association side, it gets a rather conservative approach to policy. And I think we need business leaders to take a much more proactive approach to policy. And of course, private sector, government, civil society, and consumers must support business in achieving this. So let's look at who is doing this work already. Well, there's many initiatives around the globe, and these are not even all of them. And the challenge is that there's a lot of initiatives, but they tend to focus on one piece of the puzzle. Only the US, only marine, only ports, only fuel, or it's a temporary project. And as a result, many companies complain to me, it's such a big labyrinth out there, we don't know what to join anymore. And I'm not sure if you have the same situation in your field with ports, sea or inland waterways, that at some point there's so many initiatives, you're just not sure anymore how they all fit together. So I try to map of the initiatives that I'm aware of, some of the ones that I believe are most relevant to you. And on the left we see Green Freight Program. So Clean Cargo Working Group is an initiative on emissions monitoring from sea freight. Smartway in the US is adopting this. Is started with road freight, but is moving to expand to non-road modes. Lean and Green in Europe is covering all modes already. Then you have a number of topic initiatives, and the ones that I listed here are related to data, so emissions data. Then you have a number of initiatives specifically focused on your mode, so water. And then there are a number of global development initiatives, and you saw already several of the development banks are working in this field as well as the UN. So rather than going into explain these initiatives one by one, I wanted to give you some examples. And examples I'd like to give is much more around where collaboration or leadership played a role, and was less an emphasis on, say, the technical content, because we've heard already some very good examples of adaptation yesterday and today. So Port of Rotterdam. Somebody was here this morning to present it. I have the other slides about the mitigation. What I liked about this is that this is a success because it's a collaboration between government, private sector and civil society. So as the port wanted to expand, there's a yellow bit, the Maasvlakte 2. The environmental groups didn't want that because it was a conservation area. So what they did is they had an agreement between the government, the private sector, ports, and civil society, that they would compensate by doing environmental measures on the other side. Euro 6 trucks, only Euro 6 trucks. In new terminals, they would have a key for inland vessels, so there was better connection. The railway, better connection. The terminals run entirely on wind power, and the gateway is equipped with thermal storage. So the essence of a collaboration like this is if you get players with competing what you call environment economic objectives together, you can actually come to a solution that works for all. The other one I wanted to explain is, and that's why, because I heard that working group 178, I think a lot of the initiatives that are already happening in the field of ports, so this is the one I'm aware of in North America, where on the West Coast several of the ports have joined forces. They came up with a sustainable design and construction guidelines of ports, and I think sometimes these initiatives that already exist would lend themselves beautifully to add adaptation to it. So rather than doing something entirely from scratch, some of these partnerships you can build on. In China, and I just came back from there last week, and this is quite interesting, they have a golden waterway which stretches all the way from Shanghai along the Yangtze River inland. Now, this economic region covers 40% of China's GDP and 50% of the population, so it's massive. And the river is a key part of making that economic growth possible. Now, what they're trying to do here is to not just develop the inland waterways, but also connect it to the other modes. So, for example, at the Three Gorges Dam, they're raising the shipping capacity, but they're also adding highway to mitigate some of the freight traffic when it's very busy to off the waterway onto the roads, and because of that have less stopping time. And right now it's about 18 hours that they have to wait to get through there, and then it will be reduced to almost nothing. Wuhan, which I visited, is a very big logistics center, really meant for road freight, but what they're trying to do now is link it up with the inland waterway. So here again, you're trying to make sure that the developments you're doing for waterway does not stand on its own, but is linked to other modes. And in Shanghai, the intermodal connectivity is really critical. I know one company that doesn't go to Shanghai, but only to Shenzhen, because at Shanghai they have to wait too long to get their goods on the ships. And the connectivity with the hinterland is the reason why it doesn't happen well. Now, an interesting story about Shanghai is that the terminal is located off the coast, and there's a bridge built 32 kilometers that connects the port to the land. And then there's terminals that can take it onto the railway or onto the water. However, until a few years ago, the Ministry of Railways and the Ministry of Transport were separate. And so the bridge that goes from the port to the terminal has only a road on it. So once you put the goods from the ships onto the road, and then you want to then have to transfer to the rail, it never happens. So it's often the institutions, if they don't work together, you do not get modal connectivity. And that is hugely detrimental for the economic situation, but also for the environmental. This one is actually an example that I got from the World Bank. It's in India, and it's basically a corridor that goes, well, Delhi is on the left, and Kolkata is there right at the bottom. And in this corridor, what they've done, they've connected the road with the rail. So they made a corridor that has both road and rail, and as a result, they're trying to get more goods off the road onto the railway. And this corridor was developed, but they also wanted to take into account the river that goes at the Ganges. And so as a result, you're seeing an interconnectivity between road, rail, and the water. But of course, where the problems lie? At the port. So the challenges that they have, and the ones that are highlighted yellow, are relating to waterway. It's making use of the waterway. It's improving the connectivity at Calcutta port. It's relieving the truck congestion at the port area, so it's often trucks having to wait for hours and hours to get to the port. So all the efficiency gained along that highway is lost when they get to the port. Support the development of another port. So often what you see now, especially in developing countries, that there's new ports being built. And there you have the advantage of being able to utilize the connection with road and rail. And then develop the connectivity of new ports. So what they've done in Calcutta, right at the bottom, what they're looking at, what they call is the extended gate. So really by designing the port area better to connect to the rest of the system, they're able to increase efficiency, reduce trucks waiting, and thus also reduce the emissions that are being generated. Now once you start, and I would like to add that to Jen's 5 bullets that you had before, I think connectivity with other modes is critical for adaptation. Because if you end up adapting your port for resilience, but you do not have a way of connecting it better to the rest of the other modes, you're going to have a real big problem. In the Netherlands, there's a program called Lean and Green, and it's run by an NGO called Connect, and they work together with the government and the private sector in an initiative called Top Sector Logistics. And one of their initiatives is about synchromodality. And they're looking at a number of companies who might be able to share their loads to go on barges. So previously, companies don't really use barges, often because they don't have enough volume to do it alone, and they don't really have enough time or knowledge to really set it up themselves. So what happened under this Lean and Green project is they tried to get a number of companies who have goods being moved in the same direction or an opposite direction, and then work out how can they use barges. And here's a number of companies that collaborated, Bavaria, Heinz, and Mars. And in 2013, they came together, and they had barge services picking up their goods from Heinz and Bavaria all the way to Rotterdam. By doing that, they've reduced 10,000 trucks on the busy motorways and more than 3,000 containers of their products. The point I'm trying to make here, that this is only possible for many of the waterway initiatives because the volume is so high. So barges have a higher volume than a truck. A container ship has a higher volume than a truck. It's important to collaborate between companies to make this happen. And the only way for that to then make happen is if you have the connectivity that works well. So part of the reason why these companies agree to it is that they feel that the connectivity in the port of Rotterdam is good enough for them to go to barges. If they go to barges but they can't connect to the other modes, then they lose too much time on the way. So connecting it is really critical. This one I put in there not because it's about CO2 emissions or climate, but it's I think a fantastic example of how an NGO can make a change. So you might be aware of environmental control areas where it requires ships to use low sulfur fuel when they come, say, within 200 kilometers of the coastline. And that's being introduced in North America and Europe, not in Asia yet. So what this organization did, Civic Exchange in Hong Kong, they brought together a number of marine carriers and cruise ship operators, and they established the Fair Winds Charter. What they agreed is all these companies, when they would come with their ships in the port of Hong Kong, they would switch to low sulfur fuel just while they're in the port, and when they get out of it, they switch to the dirtier version. It costs about $2 per TEU for dry and $3 per TEU for reefer per day to do this. So the cost is really, really minimal. But they needed someone to set up the logistics of getting the fuel and monitoring it. Now, this project was so successful, then this NGO went to the government and said, you see, it works. Companies are taking the lead. It works. They can do it. Can we now make it legislation? And Hong Kong last year made it policy. So here's a typical example that I think ports can really make use of in other areas as well. Get a few companies who want to act as leaders, test something out, make sure you've worked out the practicalities of what works and what not, and then take it to government. And now the good news is Hong Kong is leading the way for an ICA across the China East Coast. So what a small initiative can realize. And I think with Piank you have the opportunity to do that too. And my final example, which unfortunately has to do with earthquakes. I was there last October and I visited Christchurch, which was hit by an earthquake a number of years ago. And it was shocking to see how the city was still quite flattened in the area in the center. And they had another quite big earthquake just recently. And here is a graph that was shared with me just a few days ago. You see that the moment that the earthquake happened, so the red lines are for this year, the blue lines for last year. The moment that the earthquake happened, a huge amount of freight was shifted from rail and road onto the sea. And this is an earthquake, but imagine when you have climate change and you're going to have massive disasters like somebody mentioned the example of New York. Yeah, then ports and sea freight must be ready to take over that freight capacity. And that's, I think, part of adaptation too. It's not just about the infrastructure, it's about what do you do in times of disaster. So, as a final remark, I wanted to make the point that if you're looking at countries around the world, you have countries at different stages. So what's possible perhaps in the Netherlands may not be possible in some African countries. And so what the World Bank did is they made the Logistics Performance Index and they grouped countries by different tiers, depending on the logistics performance and the infrastructure. I really would encourage that if you as you develop guidelines for adaptation, you make a distinction between the degree of readiness of these countries for these adaptation measures, so that we don't get, things that might work in a port of Rotterdam because there's money. You try to do something the same somewhere else where there's just absolutely no money or there's not even basic infrastructure. I think if you do this, you stand a chance of helping developing countries to adapt as well. And finally, so my main takeaway is that collaboration is essential between government, private sector and civil society. It's important to have that to decarbonize waterborne freight and to make it more climate resilient. There's so many examples that exist, and except from making case studies, somebody else presented about developing case studies, please investigate it, why it has worked. What was the secrets to success and not just the end result? Remember that most collaborations do not start from climate change. They start from economic reasons or other reasons, political, and ride that wave. But all of them start with leadership. So I compliment Piyank for taking the leadership on the adaptation. And I would love to see how we can help you advance this agenda further. Thank you.